vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, and good evening, and Merry Christmas. This is Don Swans, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the December 21st issue of the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Front page, not Christmassy, but why my generation is turning to financial nihilism. It might seem reckless for Generation Z to gamble money and meme coins and sports, but many of us have lost confidence in the traditional ladder of success. Millennials and Generation Z are accused of treating finance like a game. They trade options, buy meme coins, play prediction markets, and bet on sports as if the entire economy were a casino. The criticism usually ends there, with a little finger wag and a head shake. But baby boomers and members of Generation X say this is reckless. Solid proof that social media has gamified money. But this misunderstands the mindsets of today's young people. What seems like recklessness to parents and grandparents is actually a worrisome form of economic adaptation. It's known as financial nihilism, a term coined by podcaster Dmitry Kofinas several years ago. And it describes the sense that the economic system no longer rewards prudence or long-term planning. To many people, this lack of trust doesn't make sense. Doesn't every generation have a financial struggle? Of course. Each one adapts to the pressure of its moment. Post-war America responded to the instability of the Depression and the war by building a world that promised stability. Suburbia. Deindustrializing America answered the collapse of union jobs by elevating the college degree. Every era produces its own response, shaped by the opportunities and constraints of its time. But the post-war idea of upward mobility was always contingent on certain fundamentals: strong institutions, affordable education, accessible home ownership, and stable work. Now, those conditions are buckling. For many young people, education has become a liability. Student loan debt totals $1.6 trillion as of 2024, up from $1.16 trillion in 2014. This is all according to the New York Federal Reserve. In 2004, that number was $345 billion. Real wage growth has been modest for many years, effectively locking large cohorts into limited income gains. Even the college wage premium has slipped, falling from about 80% in 2001 to about 75% in 2023, according to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. This has happened even as the cost of college has climbed by roughly 40% over the same period. Early career roles have eroded too. Entry-level jobs have thinned out due to automation and cost pressures. With only 30% of 2025 college graduates able to find entry-level jobs in their field, an 11% drop since 2024. This is all according to the Cengage Group's 2025 Graduate Employability Report. Just last week, the nation's job report showed that the unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds is at a post-pandemic high of 10.6%. That instability hits at the exact moment when people are supposed to take their first steps on the economic ladder. And then there's home ownership. Only about 32% of 27-year-olds owned a home in 2024, a number that has not budged in 2 years, according to the real estate brokerage company Redfin. It's a tough story compared to generations past. Almost 40% of boomers and Generation Xers owned a home when they were 27. The price-to-income ratio for a median home now is nearly double what it was when their parents and grandparents were buying in the 80s and 90s. The specifics vary by region, but the broader reality is that the entry point into ownership has moved farther out of reach. When every conventional path narrows, people start to look for alternatives. And in practice, that has meant turning toward the few places where a real upside still appears possible, even if the risks are high. In this environment, prediction markets, sports betting, and cryptocurrency start to look like some of the early levers that they have left. Nearly 2/3 of Generation Z and millennials think that the only way to build wealth today is through alternative methods like gambling and crypto, according to the Harris poll. A U.S. survey from Gemini, a major cryptocurrency exchange, found that nearly half of Generation Z investors own cryptocurrency. A separate study from the CFA Institute found that American Generation Z investors hold a median amount of $1,000 in crypto, a quarter of their median total investment portfolio of $4,000. Sports betting tells the same story. 31% of 18 to 34-year-olds have an account with an online sportbook, and 32% of those with an account bet 3 or more times a week, according to a 2024 Siena College St. Bonaventure survey. 30% of that same age group has been $500 or more in one day. Younger adults are consistently searching for returns in a system that offers them few traditional ones. And these platforms, from crypto exchanges to betting apps, benefit enormously from that search, since their profit is built on top of the very volatility that young people are trying to navigate. Some element of personal risk has always been central to capitalism, but when the rewards for prudence erode and the traditional path, a college degree, buying a house, working at the same job for decades starts to become more and more difficult to achieve, economic risk becomes the baseline option instead of a choice. These failures exist in a loop, too, exacerbating the problem. A stalled job market meets a higher debt load, meets an unreachable housing ladder. The pressure is not just from one system struggling, but from all three, straining at once. Faced with that reality, taking a gamble on Fartcoin or betting how many times Elon Musk tweets in a week can feel strangely rational. A small chance at a large return beats a near certainty of a slow decline. Even a stock market with an almost 20% gain over the course of 2025 cannot compete psychologically with the promise of 1,000% gain in one day. The logic is closer to game theory than pure irrationality. To be clear, traditional stocks still account for the majority of invested dollars. That's growing too. According to J.P. Morgan Chase, almost 40% of 25-year-olds have invested in traditional markets in 2024, compared to 6% in 2015. But even then, the fastest growing areas of participation are the more speculative markets. Crypto, prediction markets, and online betting have rapidly expanded among younger adults because they offer immediacy and the possibility of outsized gains, something the S&P 500 can't always replicate. According to TransUnion, Generation Z drove much of the growth in online sports betting in 2025. Crypto casinos like Stake are becoming explosively popular, partnering with celebrities like Snoop Dogg and Drake to lure young people in, according to reporting from the New York Times. The growth and chaos of these markets is the important thing to pay attention to. The mistake is assuming that young people want chaos. They don't. A Pew Research poll finds 41% of U.S. people aged 18 to 29 think that legalized sports betting is bad, up sharply from 34% only 3 years ago. People are not necessarily doing this for the thrill. They're doing it in an attempt to find a personal agency in a system that has increasingly denied it to them. All of this is also social. Reddit forums and Discord servers act as digital commons, replacing the sense of civic belonging that once came from churches or neighborhoods. People find identity through participation. They may lose money, but they gain a kind of cohesion. Young adults are not confused or bamboozled by the risks they're taking. They understand them. They're responding to an economy where the usual advice no longer lines up cleanly with outcomes. Their attention has shifted to wherever an upside still feels possible. Sometimes that's a startup. Sometimes it's crypto. Sometimes it's betting a triple parlay on a football game. These attitudes say less about the values of a generation than about the structure of the economy they are navigating. When people start treating the economy like a game, it's a sign that the traditional ways of winning no longer feel real. That article was written and contributed by Kyla Scanlon, who's the author of In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work. And on the next page is a picture at the top of the page of Rob Reiner with his son, Nick, as they attend Being Charlie, a film they made together dramatizing Nick's struggles with addiction. The article is written by Elizabeth Bernstein, and it's entitled, These Parents Understand the Reiner Story All Too Well. Parents of addicts face an impossible choice. Offer help and risk enabling their child's behavior, or sever ties and maybe lose them forever. Like many people, I was struck by the heartbreaking irony of Hollywood director Rob Reiner's death. That a man who had achieved so much and tried so hard could not save his own son. Sadly, his story is a reminder of the constant struggle of the parents of addicts trying to care for and protect a son or daughter who is self-destructive, indifferent to consequences, and possibly dangerous. They face an impossible choice: continue offering help and risk enabling more troubled behavior, or sever ties and chance losing their child forever. They struggle every day with frustration, fear, grief, guilt, anger, and shame. The parents of addicts live between a rock and a hard place, says Anna Lemke, author of Dopamine Nation, and chief of addiction medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. And it's very hard for them to know what to do. By all accounts, Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer, were loving parents who tried for decades to help their son, Nick Reiner, who is 32, overcome addiction. They hired professionals and supported him through more than a dozen stints in rehabilitation facilities. Father and son made a movie together about addiction called Being Charlie, dramatizing retelling of Nick's experience. The Reiners let Nick live in a guest house on their property, where prosecutors say he killed them in a knife attack on Sunday. If the Reiners, with all their money, connections, effort, and love, could not successfully help their son or protect themselves, what can any parent do? About 17% of people in the U.S. who are 12 or older, some 50 million people, reported having a substance use disorder in the past year, according to the latest data from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Their parents often live in a state of chronic vigilance. Imagine that any time the phone rings, it could be terrible news, says Epic Acol, a licensed marriage and family therapist in Newport Beach, California, who specializes in addiction. They're constantly bracing for the next crisis, a relapse, a legal issue, an overdose. Parents blame themselves for being unable to fix their child's problems, Eichel says. Addicted offspring often condemn parents too, she adds. They suffer from anxiety, hopelessness, and unresolved or ambiguous grief. They also often isolate themselves, which makes matters worse. Codependency becomes a problem. Parents feel responsible for their child's stability and safety. They haven't often sacrificed their own needs and those of the family, including other siblings, even to the point of being in danger. The heart of the issue is that parents are terrified that their child will die, Acol says. And when that is the case, love and fear override logic and boundaries. Linda Zagaroli, 70, of Bloomington, Illinois, spent over 2 decades terrified that her son Eric would harm himself as he battled drug addiction, depression, and anger issues. While he was in college, she realized that he was not only doing drugs, but likely selling them, and repeatedly urged him to stop. And when he didn't, she pretended to understand. I wanted to keep the line of communication open, says Zagarelli, a retired insurance company analyst. After Eric moved to Portland, Oregon in his 30s, Zagarelli, fearing for his well-being, traveled 2,000 miles back and forth for extended stays, begging him to see a therapist, buying groceries, cooking and cleaning his apartment while he mostly slept. When a 2003 suicide attempt landed Eric in the hospital for weeks, Zagaroli asked a judge to give her son, committed to psychiatric institution, she says, but was denied. They basically turned him back out on the street, she says. Less than a year later, Eric was again suicidal. This time he would not let her stay in his apartment, so she rented one down the street to be near. Eventually she moved him to Eugene, Oregon to be closer to friends. But none of this was enough. In 2024, on his 36th birthday, her son overdosed and died. I was helpless because I was fighting a demon bigger than the both of us, is what she said. Addiction is treatable if the person actively engages in a program, says Stanford's Lemke, but addicts often resist getting help or sticking with the treatment because they don't understand or accept that they are sick. It's common for an addict to also have a mental illness, making treatment more challenging, she says. Complicating matters, addiction is a progressive disease, and parents gradually tolerate increasingly extreme behavior. If an outsider looked into the family, they might be horrified with what the person will put up with. But these parents have become too accustomed to it that it has become their new normal. Therapists and loved ones often give conflicting advice about whether to cut a child off, says Joshua Coleman, a psychologist who helps families with addiction and estrangement. Moms and dads sometimes view the situation differently, too, with fathers typically leaning towards being more strict. By the time the situation is out of control, many parents have spent a fortune on treatment. They are sometimes loath to try to have their son or daughter committed to an institution because they worry the child will hold this against them. It's not always a viable option anyway. The bar to commit someone against their will is high in most states. There's no way to measure how many addicts try to physically harm or murder their parents, but psychologists share warning signs: a history of violence, sudden shifts in irrational behavior, agitation, aggression, paranoia, or isolation. If you as a parent feel you are walking on eggshells, that they may become angry or aggressive or dangerous, that is a red flag, Ecole says. Here's what the experts say parents should do if their child may become violent. Pursue advice from multiple experts. Seek support from organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Al-Anon family groups, and Smart Recovery. Change the locks or put in an alarm system. Think about what you would do if this was not your child. Jen Hope knew she'd hit her rock bottom. As she sat in an emergency room in 2015, waiting for an update on her son, Jake Burgess, a social worker told her, "You need to take care of yourself. I don't know if this kid is going to make it." Hope was 5 years into trying to care for her son, who had struggled with drug and alcohol addiction since he was 16. She never told anyone because she was ashamed and thought people would think she was a bad mom. She and her husband had endured years of Jake's verbal abuse and self-destruction. One night, she hid upstairs with her younger daughter as her husband and police tried to calm her furious son outside. "We always let him come home, thinking that if we gave him a stable place to live and told him how much he was loved and how smart he was, it would make him not want to use," says Hope, 54, of Fort Wayne, Indiana. But that is now not how this disease works. Jake did multiple stints in detoxification and rehab centers and jail, and was a homeless at one point. Then in 2017, after a cousin kicked him out, he decided to finally help himself. He Googled addiction treatment work farm, found one in West Virginia and got sober. College and law school followed. Now he's a personal injury attorney. Hope went on to found the mom of an addict, a company that aims to educate and connect parents whose children struggle with addiction. She and Jake, 32, sometimes speak publicly together. I want other families to know that they are not alone, and it isn't their fault, she says. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review and the Niagara Frontier Radio reading service. Let me drop this on you. Great title. I thought a cane would make me feel old. It surprised me. It's by Daniel Axt, who writes the journal's weekly news quiz and is the publisher of Tivoli Books. One morning recently, I threw out my back. It would not have been my first choice for something to discard. I'd have nominated the haggard horse face that stares back at me daily when I shave. But nobody asked me. I just bent over, and on rising was halted by the grip of agony on my lower spine. I couldn't even walk without leaning on the countertops in the kitchen. Now what? I never had an episode quite like this, but my wife Louise is no stranger to back troubles, and she offered to loan me the cane she occasionally uses. She might just as well have suggested that we start shopping for a nursing home. You can't be serious, I proclaimed, embarking on a brief and ineffective cane mutiny. At 69, I considered myself far too young and fit for such a symbol of senescence. The riddle of the Sphinx flashed through my mind. What walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 at night? Oedipus knew that it was us. From crawling baby to upright maturity to old age, when a staff or cane becomes a third foot. I have enough trouble with the feet I've got, not least their tendency to find their way into my mouth. And the cane on offer seemed especially objectionable. Were I to require a cane, I like to think it would be custom made from select woods, polished to a sheen worthy of Fred Astaire, and heavy enough to brain anyone foolish enough to accost me with nefarious intentions. Louise's emergency cane was made of featherweight aluminum by a medical supply company, but it had a crucial feature: adjustability. That made it possible for me to use it even though I'm really a foot taller than she is. Before I knew it, she had drawn the stick out to suitable length. Yes, raising Cain. Why hold back? And since she had canceled a much-anticipated hike due to my infirmity, the least I could do was to try it. And you know what? It was a big help. For the uninitiated, what a cane seems to do is take a load off, even though you carry it on only one side. This load shifting enabled me to move around despite my vengeful lower back. I can also report that a cane is more useful than a lot of grunting if you're looking to get out of a chair. One gets the hang of a cane right away, evidently, and in no time my stance had shifted from aversion to fascination. By midday, my back was significantly better, but I was in no hurry to shed this latest accoutrement of age. Far from an indignity, I thought it lent a certain gravitas, otherwise absent from my banal demeanor. I was soon finding reasons to hobble past a full-length mirror, noting with satisfaction the dignified figure I seemed to cut. I tried leaning on it, hand on hip, and felt myself transformed from a geriatric sourpuss into a bemused observer of the human cavalcade. Or so it helped me to imagine. Even as it propped me up, the cane undermined my ability to carry things around. It seems to strongly prefer my dominant right hand. My left, though free, found it hard to hold a cup of tea steady enough to reach my office without sloshing. How would I fare later, schlepping a precious martini into the living room? Like all helpers, it seems a cane makes demands of its own. Lean it against a table edge, wall, or other angle-free surface, and it's likely to come crashing noisily to the floor, which is not just embarrassing, but requires a lot of bending and groaning unless some helpful onlooker leaps to the rescue. And then there was the sound. I'd assumed my gait would take on a rhythmic thumping, that auditory mark of a cane, but with an aluminum version, this was more of an anemic click, possibly easier on floors and eardrums, but certainly less opposing. Yet, thanks to Louise's cane, I was able. I see now that it's easy to be cavalier about the paraphernalia of aging when you know they're only temporary. But of course, everything is only temporary, including the good health I felt sure would enable me to lay aside the cane when my back was better. Seated at my desk, wondering where I had left the darn thing, another burden of a cane user, I began to think of it more in sober terms of a memento mori, or at least as a reminder of disability, some form of which may be lurking in my future. Fortunately, I have had to get too used to it. Soon enough, my back was functioning normally, and the cane went back into the closet, where it reposes in a great show of harmlessness, a harbinger of decline among golf umbrellas, hockey sticks, and other emblems of fleeting good health. Knowing it's there is a mixed blessing. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from last Sunday's Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. On page C4, there's an attractive picture of Kristen Wagoner, Chief Executive of the Alliance Defending Freedom, who is trying to reshape the American legal landscape on LGBTQ issues. Christine Wagoner has helped the evangelical right get much of what it wanted from a conservative Supreme Court with a carefully honed message and cheery disposition. But when the chief executive of the Alliance Defending Freedom, a Christian legal advocacy group with a $130 million annual budget, when it addressed the National Conservatism Conference in September, she gave a dark warning. If we begin to think that this vibe shift is permanent or self-sustaining, we will fail future generations, and worse, we will fail the soul of liberty itself. After winning 16 Supreme Court cases that have fundamentally altered the American legal landscape, including decisions overturning the right to abortion and reaffirming religious invocations at government meetings, Wagoner and her group have now set their sights on another fight. With a friendly Supreme Court and a rightward cultural shift afoot, they are pursuing cases that would reshape federal law to reflect conservative Christian social values on LGBTQ issues. Opponents say the effort will undermine decades of progress in civil rights. The Alliance Defending Freedom has 4 cases before the Supreme Court this term, including one challenging a ban in Colorado on conversion therapy, which discourages children from adopting gay identities or transitioning genders. In January, ADF will defend Idaho and West Virginia laws that ban transgender students from participating in women's sports. Seated in her office in November, Wagoner said ADF is fighting for freedom of expression and the freedom to practice all religions. I think the American public, if they were to understand the principles that are at stake, would actually be with us more often than not. Behind her, near family photos and decorative bowls of candy, sat a sign that reads, "If not now, when?" Wagoner's antagonists view her as trying to put a rosy spin on discrimination. "In the name of defending free speech," said David Cole, former National Legal Director for the ACLU, ADF is in fact pursuing an anti-gay and anti-trans agenda. ADF's efforts have led Wagoner to arguments that are potentially at odds with the conservative judicial framework known as originalism, which aims to apply constitutional text as it was understood when adopted. As a recent Federalist Society gathering of conservative lawyers, Wagoner debated a feminist scholar about whether parents have a constitutional right to be notified if their child is transitioning genders at school. Wagoner's take: courts have for years ruled that parents have fundamental rights over their children that are being disregarded by wayward administrators. The view from University of Chicago Law School professor Mary Ann Case: such parental rights don't appear in the Constitution. So Wegener was essentially trying to write her policy preferences into the national charter. It was the same thing conservatives accused liberal judges of doing for years. I thought you all kind of approved of Justice Scalia, Case said to Laughter, referring to the late Supreme Court justice who popularized originalism. Antonin Scalia got a lot right, Wegener replied. I wouldn't say he was perfect, though. The child of a Pentecostal school principal, raised outside Portland, Oregon, Wegener grew up witnessing tension between religious groups and a progressive local government. She chose for law school Regent University, founded by the late televangelist Pat Robertson, because it offered what she calls a Judeo-Christian legal education. When Wegener joined ADF in 2013, she brought a focus of plaintiffs with compelling stories. The left, Wegener posited, had excelled at putting sympathetic characters before courts and winning public support. The right, she said, needed its own stories. Critics say that in its zeal to get its agenda into court, ADF has manufactured disputes. In 2016, ADF sued to invalidate portions of a Minnesota civil rights law on behalf of Christian wedding videographers who said they feared they might be required to provide their services to same-sex couples. ADF later dropped the case, and the judge overseeing it said it looked like the lawsuit was conjured up to establish binding First Amendment precedent, rather than to allow them to craft wedding videos, of which they made exactly 2. ADF says it had legitimate clients whose business plans were disrupted by the coronavirus pandemic. In other cases, Wegener's clients have become culture war stars. Take Jack Phillips, a Colorado baker or cake artist, as ADF described him, who refused for reasons of faith to make a cake for a gay wedding and was sanctioned by the state. ADF appealed to the Supreme Court in 2016, and Phillips and Wegener went on The View for a grilling from the show's 5 co-hosts. I'm just trying to preserve my right as an artist to decide which artistic endeavors I will do, said Phillips. The case put in conflict 2 lines of jurisprudence that the Supreme Court had been developing: equality for LGBTQ Americans and deference to religious exercise. ADF won the case on a technicality, but it proved a turning point for a conservative court that increasingly sees discrimination based on sexual orientation as more acceptable than bias based on race or ethnicity. Wegener became ADF's CEO in 2022, the day before ADF argued its first court case of the term in October. Wegener traversed Washington, D.C. in a black SUV a security guard riding in the front seat. She was teaming up for media interviews with Kaylee Childs, a Christian therapist in Colorado and ADF's plaintiff in challenging a state law barring licensed counselors from using conversion therapy. Colorado argues that its law protects young people from a misguided practice, which it says could lead to depression or even suicide. While licensed therapists must comply with the law, religious ministries are free to engage in conversion therapy, the state notes. At an afternoon stop, Wagner said the state was allowing conversations that push gender transition while blocking therapists from asking questions. This is viewpoint discrimination, she told podcasters Isabel Brown, a violation of First Amendment free speech rights. Later, she paid a visit to ADF's lawyers, who for days had been preparing their arguments in a hotel conference room. Wagner sat down with the group to play the part of a skeptical justice. If the statute says child can help a child explore gender issues, then what's the problem? She asked. The statute says counseling cannot aim to change a patient's views. The court is expected to rule next year. ADF has more than doubled in size over the last decade. Among its staff is Erin Hawley, former law clerk for Chief Justice John Roberts, and the wife of Missouri Republican Senator Josh Hawley. House Speaker Mike Johnson previously worked as a lawyer for ADF. Before she was on the court, Justice Amy Coney Barrett taught at an ADF program for Christian law students. While most of its donors aren't disclosed, records show that the Servant Foundation, a philanthropy linked to the evangelical family that founded Hobby Lobby, has donated tens of millions of dollars. ADF is technically organized as a ministry, and new employees sign a statement affirming their Christian beliefs. Its Northern Virginia offices feature a prayer room and hall for employee-only chapel services held during work. Critics say ADF is building case law with an eye on even bigger prize, getting the court to examine the right to same-sex marriage. In July, one of Wagner's top deputies penned an essay attacking the 2015 ruling that enshrined that right. Obergefell may be the law, wrote ADF Vice President John Birch, but it is not the end of the conversation. Asked about same-sex marriage, Wagner said, "That's not something we're focused on." Joe Queenan is a regular contributor of short, most interesting articles under the heading of Moving Targets. This week, his target is, quote, "How I survived the worst haircut of my life," end of quote. Toward the end of my college years, a malicious barber pointed to the receding hairline on the right side of my head and pronounced that I'd be bald by the time I was 30. He based this genetically dubious conclusion on the fact that my father went bald early, when in fact centuries of top-notch chromosomal research disproved the theory that bald fathers beget bald sons. Satisfied that he had wrecked my day, if not my life, he got to work manhandling my hair that many barbers had been manhandling my hair since I was a hapless toddler. I did not go bald, and still haven't. But after the experience, I stopped going to barbers for decades, either clipping my hair myself or asking my wife to do it. I hated the fact that barbers felt it necessary to impose their tonsorial will on their victims' cutting hair to make you look the way they wanted you to look, regardless of your own wishes. When my career got going and it became necessary to sport a plausible hairdo, I started patronizing female hairdressers and had no further problems for the next 20 years. Only once did I go back to see a barber, a choice I'd immediately regret. I became persuaded that when you stop patronizing the person who normally cuts your hair somehow knows it and will immediately stop behaving itself. Viewing you as a traitor, your betrayed, seditious hair will resist all efforts to rectify a bad situation and will never go back to being obedient and cooperative until you crawl back to your regular stylist and get a remedial haircut. Years passed and my hair continued to perform admirably. But then a few weeks ago I had an event to attend and desperately needed a haircut right away. When I realized that the grooming salon I patronized was closed that day, I broke down and let a barber cut my hair. The results were tragic. Ignoring my advanced age, the barber decided that what I'd really look like would be a fad. One of those indecisive, prepubescent haircuts that trim your hair unevenly and turn the top of your head into a parallelogram. Obvious to the nightmare that was unfolding, I allowed the barber to give me the worst haircut I've ever had in my life. How bad? I had only just opened the door to my house when my wife realized the misfortune that had befallen me and began snipping here and there to restore some sort of logic and sanity to the top of my head. The next few weeks were hell. At Thanksgiving, my sister noted that I had recently had a haircut, barely able to conceal their smirks. Friends poked fun at my juvenile, geometrically misguided do, noting that I had a new look. Eventually, I realized that I would have to go back to my regular stylist and have her fix my hair, which she did, more or less. But even now, weeks after the disaster, I would still feel there's something wrong with my hair, that I may have to break down and get a jarhead cut and start all over again. But the fact is that hair has been butchered, never fully recovers from the outrage. You have to grow new hair to get things back on even keel. I'm growing it as fast as I can. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 21st issue of the Wall Street Journal Review. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. So, next week we'll be with you on New Year's Day. Your reader has been Don Swans. And again, thank you for listening on this Christmas Day.
Coming up next on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service is the New York Times. Following that at 9 o'clock is Fortune Magazine. At 10 o'clock, we have an old-time radio special for this Christmas Day. It's all Christmas-related content. Stay with us for these readings and more. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives $2 for every $100 in Dash's register tapes. Radio reading has raised thousands of dollars so far. Anyone can drop off their dashes tapes to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,